So we're dealing tonight with the Book of Wisdom, and the Book of Wisdom is the last book of the Bible to be written. Sorry, the last book of the Old Testament to be written, and written on the threshold of the birth of Christ, because at least one assumes from the evidence that it's written in the reign of the Emperor Augustus, who was the emperor when Christ was born. All right, so even though it's written so recently, as a matter of fact, one of the early Christian lists of books, the Muratorian canon, dating from around the year 200, puts it in as a New Testament book because it's so recent, which is a bit strange for us. Even though it's written so recently, nonetheless, when St. Paul comes to write the letter to the Romans, he makes allusion to the Book of Wisdom. And St. Matthew as well, when he constructs his account of Jesus' death, seems to take lines out of the Book of Wisdom as well. So the Book of Wisdom speaks of the unjust or the godless who persecute the righteous man because he is righteous. And one of the things they say to him is, if the righteous man is God's son, God will help him and will deliver him, using the Greek verb ruetai, to rescue. And Matthew then, when he speaks of Jesus on the cross, he has the crowd saying to him, he saved others, he cannot save himself. Let God deliver him. Same verb, ruetai. Now, let God deliver him now if he desires him, for he said, I am the Son of God. Okay, so same verb and same concept, that because he is the Son, because he is the Son of God, God's Son, that God will help him and deliver him. It's there in the Book of Wisdom. And Matthew, when he tells the story, as I say, of Jesus' crucifixion, seems to expect his readers to recognize that this is a fulfillment of the Book of Wisdom, and that this is quite simply the persecution of the righteous and the just man by the godless. All right, so there are all sorts of reasons as to why we assume that it is written so late in the time of Augustus, one of which is in Wisdom 14:22. Right? Not really advising those of you who have your Bibles to go searching because it's only one line. And it's speaking about the pagans, and it says, afterward, it was not enough for them to be wrong, to err about the knowledge of God, but they live in great strife due to ignorance. So they're always fighting, and they called such great evils peace. Okay, so, and this, of course, was Augustus's achievement that he imposed on Rome and on the empire, peace. And he saw himself as being the bringer of peace. And if you go to Rome today, you'll see the Ara Pacis, the altar of peace, set up by Augustus to himself, because he defeated who? Mark Antony, was it? In the Civil War. All right. So this is one indication. Then there are also lots of addresses to you who rule over nations, and so on and so forth. So the purpose of the book, in one sense, is to gather together all the wisdom of Israel. So it's also thought to be written in Alexandria in Egypt. Okay, so Alexandria was a little bit like New York, in the sense that it was outside Israel, but had a huge population of Jews. Okay, so just like New York today, it was a great Jewish center, right? Even as much as Israel itself. The language is the Greek of Alexandria, so they say. What that means, I don't know. So it's a gathering together of Jewish wisdom together with Greek philosophy in places as well. In places that it reflects Philo, who of course is one of the great Jewish writers, non-Christian Jewish writers of the first century, and his philosophy, as well his response to paganism. And they say that one of the reasons why it's written is that naturally the young Jewish teenagers and the young men would have had a temptation to be drawn towards Greek culture and paganism, okay, which is what we call today globalization. And this book was written to assure them that their own Jewish heritage is far superior to that. So the Book of Wisdom can be divided into three parts. One is chapters 1 to 6, which is to a large extent about the just man and the unjust or the godless and how they fare. So we'll take a look at that in a few seconds. The second then is about wisdom herself, which is a very beautiful few chapters there. And lastly then is what happens is there is what's called a diptych, which is a two-sided picture of the just and the godless. Okay, so in fact the story is based on Israel, the just, of course, and Egypt in the time of the Exodus. Okay, and the different, how God afflicted the Egyptians with plagues and the Israelites with salvation. But his point isn't really Israel against Egypt. His point, because he never mentions the word Israel, he never mentions the word Egypt. He speaks about the righteous or the just and the godless. Right, so the first chapter is 1 to 6. Those of you who do have Bibles with you, just want to invite you there to take a look at the opening lines, where it says, "Love righteousness, love righteousness, you rulers of the earth. Think of the Lord with uprightness and seek him with sincerity of heart." Okay, so those of you who were at the talk on Thursday night, I mentioned there very briefly that wisdom in Israel is tied together with justice. Okay, so the just man is the wise man, and the wise man is the just man, and also with kings. Okay, so wisdom is the quintessential virtue of the kings. So love righteousness, you who are rulers on the earth. And seek him with all your heart. Okay, and without asking you to go there, there's no point in that. At the very end of this section, in Wisdom 6, it is going to say again, wisdom is radiant and unfading, and she is easily discerned by those who love her and found by those who seek her. Okay, so that idea of loving wisdom. So loving and seeking righteousness is the opening line. And at the end of this section, chapters 1 to 6, in verses 12 and 13, once again, or 12, wisdom is radiant and unfading, and she is easily discerned by those who love her and is found by those who seek her. So this is what we call an inclusio, a type of bracket by different phrases that for the ancient readers, the readers in antiquity would have demarcated a certain section. Good. So also in verse 1, love righteousness in 1:1, and then in 1:15, for righteousness is immortal. Right, and this also becomes, this is Wisdom 1:15, for righteousness is immortal. And so the values of righteousness are not only justice, but they also reward the person with immortality. Right. Now, what is interesting here, if you like, is that the book of Proverbs, so the book of Proverbs is the original, so it seems the original of the wisdom books in the Bible, of which we count 6. Okay, and the book of wisdom is the last. And the book of Proverbs also begins with speaking not so much about wisdom, so it gives a little introduction to wisdom, but then it speaks about those who are wicked. Right? So it's as if it's trying to teach us about wisdom by speaking about the enemies of wisdom first of all. Okay, and the unjust. And the book of wisdom does exactly the same thing. And it says it in a way that I think is very profound. So let me get my facts correct here. Yes, so up till 1:15, 1 to 1:15 is love righteousness, and then verse 15, for righteousness is immortal. And then it says just before that in verse 13, a very important theological point. So 1:13, God did not make death, and he does not delight in the death of the living. For he created all things that they might exist, and the generative forces, or the creatures of the world, are wholesome, and there is no destructive poison in them, and the dominion of Hades is not on earth, for righteousness is immortal. All right, so in that sense, what we see here is you know that St. John, the evangelist, in his first letter, when he speaks about his experience of Christ, he'll begin by saying that which has existed since the beginning, that we have heard and seen and touched with our own hands and seen with our own eyes and so on. And then he says, and this is the message. So he sums up all his experience of Christ. This is the message that we have heard from him and pass on to you, that God is light, and in him there is no darkness at all. All right? So just think for a second that, put in the context of a pagan world, that this is quite radical. Okay? Because Tertullian once said that every Christian heresy begins with the question of what is evil and where does it come from? So evil, the presence of evil in the world is one of the big questions that is on everybody's mind. And in that sense, we say that we can naturally know God. And that's true. We can know that God exists. But as soon as we really begin to think about him naturally, we also begin to realize that as well as the goodness of the world, there's evil in the world. And so many people have thought that God is both good and evil. Okay, so for example, yin and yang in China would be an example of that as well. Or in pagan religions, Baal is the good god, and he's fighting against Yam, the bad god. And sometimes Baal is winning, and there's good, and sometimes Yam is winning. And then we saw Zeus the other night as well. Zeus has two amphoras, and he takes out good for some and flings it at them, and he takes out bad for others and he flings it at them. Okay, so this is very different, right? God did not make death. So wherever death comes from, wherever evil in the world comes from, it doesn't come from God. All right? Considering him a friend, they pined away, and they made it a covenant with him, because they are fit to belong to his party. Okay, and that line, belonging to his party, recurs later on again. And why did they do that? Beginning of chapter 2. And the real reason why men do evil and so summon death is their despair. For they reasoned unsoundly, saying to themselves, short and sorrowful is our life, and there is no remedy when a man comes to his end, and no one has been known to return from Hades. Interesting little line. No one has been known to return from Hades. Christ at this point has not yet died, has not yet been born, has not yet died, has not yet descended into hell and returned from Hades. Because we were born by mere chance, and hereafter we shall be as though we had never been. Okay, so classical modern atheism, if you like, and the idea of the of evolution or evolutionism, or the multiverse, all of which see the origin of the world as we know it in pure chance, right, without any meaning whatsoever. And hereafter we shall be as though we had never been, because the breath in our nostrils is smoke, and reason is a spark enkindled by the beating of our hearts. When it is extinguished, the body will turn to dust, will turn to ashes, and the spirit will dissolve like empty air. And so it goes on, the wicked speaking at this time. And then they go on, if I go to verse 6 there, chapter 2. So their response to their despair is this. Come, therefore, let us enjoy the good things that exist and make use of the creation to the full as in our youth. And let us take our fill of costly wine and perfumes, and let no flower of spring pass by us. Let us crown ourselves with rosebuds before they wither. Let none of us fail to share in our revelry. Everywhere let us leave signs of our enjoyment, because this is our portion and this is our lot. Very good. So they're just going to enjoy the pleasures of this life because they have no future whatsoever. But then, in verse 10, it takes a turn, because not only are they simply enjoying themselves in response to their despair, but they're also now going to oppress all those who disagree with them. Let us oppress the righteous poor man. Let us not spare the widow, nor regard the grey hairs of the aged. But let our might be our law of right, for what is weak proves itself to be useless. Let us lie in wait for the righteous man, because he is inconvenient to us and opposes our actions. He reproaches us for our sins against the law and accuses us of sins against our training. And then it goes on, he professes to have knowledge of God and calls himself a child of the Lord. He became to us a reproof to our thoughts. The very sight of him is a burden to us, because his manner of life is unlike that of others, and his ways are strange. We are considered by him as something base, and he avoids our ways as unclean. He calls the last end of the righteous happy and boasts that God is his Father. Right? So, bet you anything, as you're reading these words, you can put yourself into this context as well. Okay, and if you like, Christians in modern time too. Of course, this was written by a Jew in his own time as well. And then it goes on to quote that, or to speak those lines, which St. Matthew will later, as I say, reuse for Jesus in the crucifixion scene. Let us see if his words are true, and let us test what will happen at the end of his life. For if the righteous man is God's son, is the Son of God, he will help him and will deliver him from the hand of his adversaries. Let us test him with insult and torture, that we may find out how gentle he is, and make trial of his forbearance. Let us condemn him to a shameful death, for according to what he says, he will be protected. Okay, so little wonder then that the Christians consider this book to be inspired, right? That it is the inspired word of God, because they see Christ in it, even though it is written before Christ was born. And then it responds to them, thus they reasoned, but they were led astray, for their wickedness blinded them, and they did not know the secret purposes of God, nor hope for the wages of holiness, nor discern the prize for blameless souls. And then once again it returns to the themes that it began with. For God created man for incorruption, and made him in the image of his own eternity. But through the devil's envy, death entered the world, and those who belong to his party experience it. Okay, so through the devil's envy. Right, so in a sense, this is our first commentary on the fall in the book of Genesis, and who is that serpent? Right, so scholars will often say today that, well, the serpent is not the devil, because, or at least in the literal sense, because we don't see a real sense in such an ancient text of a personal devil. Okay, maybe not, but certainly by the time of wisdom, the serpent is the devil. Okay, and out of his envy, out of his jealousy, he entered the world and bringing death with him. Okay, so St. Paul then will, of course, give the classical expose of this in Romans 5, right, where he speaks of original sin, okay, as the sin of Adam itself spreading to all men, for all men sinned. Okay, even though their sin was unlike that of Adam. Right, but Paul is really, in a sense, echoing, if not building on, certainly echoing what's already here in the Book of Wisdom. And then it goes on, right? So I'm not going to read the entire book as we go through it, but this passage is particularly famous for its use in funerals. Okay, the souls of the righteous are in the hands of God, and no torment will ever touch them. In the eyes of the foolish, they seem to have died, and their departure was thought to be an affliction, and their going from us to be their destruction, but they are at peace. For though in the sight of men they were punished, their hope is full of immortality. Having been disciplined a little, they will receive great good, because God tested them and found them worthy of himself. Like gold in the furnace he tried them, and like a sacrificial burnt offering he accepted them, and so on. All right, so the book of Proverbs, we mentioned this again on Thursday evening at the talk there, for those of you who were there. The book of Proverbs, when it speaks about the judgment, it says that the wicked will be judged, right, and they'll be found wanting. But at this stage, back in the 7th century BC, there's no real sense of eternal life yet. Okay, it's only later on, with our good friends, the Pharisees especially, right, that the idea of eternal life and resurrection comes to be part of Israel's thought. So the book of Proverbs is quite sure that the wicked will be punished in this world. Right? But you see here with the book of Wisdom, it doesn't say such a thing anymore, which we more or less know to be true, right? Because the wicked often survive very happily and comfortably until their death. But it does say that it moves judgment now to the day of death. Okay, and it's in eternity that the wicked will be punished and the just will enjoy the rewards of their labors and particularly of their sufferings. Okay, so that's the first one there. For though in the sight of men they were punished, yet their hope is full of immortality. In the time of their visitation, they will shine forth. They will run like sparks through the stubble. They will govern nations and rule over peoples, and the Lord will reign over them forever. All right? That's the beginning of chapter 3. Chapter 3, verse 10. But the ungodly will be punished as their reasoning deserves, who regarded the righteous man and rebelled against the Lord, and so on. And then it goes on, just the second half of chapter 3 and the first half of chapter 4, I think, to say that even the righteous man or the righteous woman in this world who has no children, nonetheless, their offspring and their heritage will be great. Right? Whereas, so that's just another aspect of the same thing, that they will have that immortal reward from the Lord. And then I'm turning now to chapter 4, verse 16. The righteous man who has died will condemn the ungodly who are living, and youth that is quickly perfected will condemn the prolonged old age of the unrighteous man. For they will see the end of the wise man and will not understand what the Lord proposed for him and for what he kept him safe. They will see and will have contempt for him, but the Lord will laugh them to scorn. After this, they will become dishonored corpses and an outrage among the dead forever, because he will dash them speechless to the ground and shake them from their foundations. They will be left utterly dry and barren, and they will suffer anguish, and the memory of them will perish. Okay, and it goes on then in chapter 5 to play out, in a sense, what is happening in heaven. So it's like theatre, right? The wicked are up there in heaven, and they see the righteous man that they persecuted and eventually put to death. And they start speaking to themselves. This is the man, I'm at chapter 5, verse 4. This is the man whom we once held in derision and made a byword of reproach. We fools! We thought that his life was madness and that his end was without honour, because he was so pious and just, while they were oppressing and getting what they wanted from out of the poor. Why has he been numbered among the sons of God, and why is his lot among the saints? So it was we who strayed from the way of truth, and the light of righteousness did not shine in us, and the sun did not rise upon us, and so on. All right. Good. So as you see, the first 6 chapters are really a play back and forth between the righteous and the wicked. Okay, as to and in the two things outstanding, really. One is how judgment is given at death. Okay, so a very strong sense of eternal life and punishment and reward. Okay, let's emphasize the idea of reward. And the second then is to remember that Christ is present in here. Okay, that Christ is the just man. All right, along with all those who follow him. Now, where I want to go to next is the beginning of the next section, which is 622. So this is a section then that begins, the middle section, and it is going to take us until chapter 10. Now, I forgot to say at the start, who is speaking here? It's King Solomon. Okay, so the book itself is written about 900 years after Solomon lived. Nonetheless, he is given the honor of, or the title of being its author. All right, because Solomon is the archetypal wise man. All right, which is a funny thing, considering that his reign was such a disaster in the end, and led to such oppression for the people of Israel in their own ways. Dante as well, interestingly enough, when he so Book of Wisdom is attributed to Solomon. Proverbs, large parts of Proverbs, as explicitly, about 100 of the Psalms, maybe a little less. The Song of Songs is the song which is Solomon. The Song of Songs, which is Solomon's. So, in other words, Solomon is this big figure in the Old Testament for his wisdom. And Dante, when he has in the Paradiso, as some of you will know, when he travels up and Virgil has to leave him behind, Then Beatrice leaves him behind, and as he goes up, Bernard takes over, and then Our Blessed Lady in guiding him to the vision of Christ. But along the way he passes Solomon, and Solomon is among the most radiant of all the saints. Okay, so for all his foolishness that we see in the biblical account of him, Dante at least remembers him in that way for all his wisdom, which I think is reflected in the Old Testament as well elsewhere. So Solomon is speaking, and he says, I will tell you what wisdom is and how she came to be, and I will hide no secrets from you, but I will trace her course from the beginning of creation and make knowledge of her clear, and I will not pass by the truth. Okay, so wisdom here is a woman, right? Wisdom is personalized and is a woman, which we already see in the book of Proverbs, many centuries before that, that wisdom is she, through whom all things were made. She is with the Father at creation. It's Proverbs 8 and 9. In Ecclesiasticus, written about 200 BC, a little after, maybe about 180 BC, in chapter 24 of Ecclesiasticus, you can read it there, wisdom begins to speak herself. Okay, that she comes forth from God, and God puts her into creation, into all nations. Okay, not just Israel, but the place where she has her home on all the earth is not equally among all nations, but in the temple in Jerusalem, okay, which becomes the seat of wisdom on the face of the earth. Right? So here we have a third time that wisdom is personified in the scriptures. Okay, but not this time she isn't speaking like she was in Ecclesiasticus and Proverbs. She is being spoken about by Solomon. And then, so Solomon, first of all, begins to speak. And he has a great big poem. Let me try and get my details right. In chapter 8, but we're just going to go through chapter 7 a little. So just the beginning of chapter 7, he says, I also am mortal like all men. A descendant of the first formed child of earth, and in the womb of a mother I was molded into flesh within the period of 10 months. Okay, so he says, in other words, that though he is a king, nonetheless he is a man. Okay, and he was once a little baby, right, wrapped in swaddling cloths and nappies. So, and then 7:7, therefore I prayed and understanding was given me. I called upon God and the spirit of wisdom came to me. I preferred her to scepters and thrones, and I counted wealth as nothing in comparison with her. Neither did I liken her to any priceless gem, because all gold is but a little sand in her sight, and silver will be accounted as clay before her. I loved her more than health and beauty, and I chose to have her rather than light, because her radiance never ceases. All good things come to me along with her, and in her hands uncounted wealth. I rejoice in them all, because wisdom leads them, but I did not know that she was their mother. I learned without guile and impart without grudging. I do not hide her wealth, for it is an unfailing treasure for men. Those who get it obtain friendship with God, commended by the gifts that come from instruction. Then he goes on to pray for the ability to speak properly about wisdom. And then he goes on, if you go to verse 22, he says, for in her is a spirit that is. Right? And this is what you should learn off the next time you're on a long bus journey and you've nothing to do. You can learn off these 21 characteristics of wisdom. In her is a spirit that is intelligent, holy, unique, manifold, subtle, mobile, clear, unpolluted, distinct, invulnerable, loving the good, keen, irresistible, beneficent, humane, steadfast, sure, free from anxiety, all-powerful, overseeing all, and penetrating through all spirits that are intelligent and pure and most subtle. Okay, so he gives those 21 characteristics of wisdom. Why 21? Difficult to say. The only thing that I've ever heard about this is that in Deuteronomy, I think it's 31 or 32, when Moses makes his prayer, he has 21 words before he comes to that prayer. And so the rabbis are saying that 21 is a special number. I don't know, right? There are also 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet, I think. So that might have something to do with it. Now, Just going on from that is the second thing to pull out there is verse 26. I'm sorry, just keep going there. Verse 25, for she is a breath of the power of God, a pure emanation of the glory of the Almighty. Right? I don't have notes on this, it only occurs to me as I read it, but this is reflected in the opening lines of the letter to the Hebrews as well. If you just give me a few seconds to find that. He reflects the glory of God, this is Christ, and bears the very stamp of his nature, upholding the universe by his word of power. Okay, so reflecting the glory of God, that's Christ in the letter to the Hebrews, and wisdom here. She is a breath of the power of God, a pure emanation, a reflection of the eternal light. There in 26. A spotless mirror of the working of God and an image of his goodness. Okay, so all those very stark sayings that the letter to the Hebrews will be glad then to apply to Christ as well. And then a very beautiful line in 7:27. Though she is but one, she can do all things, and while remaining in herself, she renews all things. In every generation, she passes into holy souls and makes them friends of God and prophets. Okay, so in that sense, Christ's invisible mission, which is that through the grace of the Holy Spirit, he also comes to dwell in us. In every generation, she passes into holy souls and makes them friends of God and prophets. Right, so the indwelling of the Trinity within us, the gift of the Word of God invisibly in us, that gives us the gift of the knowledge of God and his wisdom that is shared with us as well. For she is more beautiful than the stars and excels every constellation, more beautiful than the sun and excels every constellation of the stars. Compared with the light, she is found to be superior, for it is succeeded by the night, but against wisdom, evil does not prevail. Okay, so the sun rises and the sun sets, but wisdom never sets. Wisdom is always shining, night and day. And then finally, she reaches mightily from one end of the earth to the other, and she orders all things well. Right, so the Latin to that, which is in one of the O antiphons at Advent, is that she orders all things strongly and sweetly. Right, that wisdom is both strong and sweet at the same time, and orders all the world, all our lives, in wisdom. Okay, so wonderful teaching. Solomon then goes on to say in chapter 8, I loved her and sought her from my youth, and I desired to take her for my bride. Okay, so this is actually a theme that runs right through the wisdom literature from the book of Proverbs. One of the lines in Proverbs, you might know it off by heart, is that if you want to be wise, find a wife. Okay? Sorry about that, folks. Right? For ladies, you get the message, right? But it's the sense of marrying wisdom, right? That the relationship to wisdom should be so close that it is that of a lover. All right? This is there in wisdom in Proverbs, centuries before, and it's here again that Solomon wishes to take her for a bride. King David as well, we mentioned this the other night, as he's fleeing from Saul, he meets Abigail, and Abigail, when he's about to massacre all the men of the camp of Nabal, I think it's 1 Samuel 26, I think is the address for that. Abigail rushes out and teaches him how to be just as a monarch. And then Nabal dies and David marries her. Okay, so in other words, she is the wise woman and David takes her as his bride. Okay, so this idea of loving wisdom as a bride is a constant right throughout all these centuries. Then he begins his prayer, chapter 9. O God of my fathers and Lord of mercy, who have made all things by your word and by your wisdom have formed man to have dominion over the creatures you have made. What I'm going to say about this prayer of Solomon is that it is what we call a chiasm, okay, which is a series of mirror images of each other that come to a center, and the very center of it is verse 10. So chapter 9, verse 10. I'm just going to read there, verse 9 first. With you is wisdom, speaking to God. With you is wisdom who knows your works and was present when you made the world. All right, so God made the world through wisdom. And to understand what is pleasing in your sight and what is right according to your commandments. And then the centerpiece of this prayer. Send her forth from the holy heavens, and from the throne of your glory send her, that she may be with me and toil, and that I may learn what is pleasing to you. Okay, so that's Solomon's prayer for wisdom as a bride in this prayer. The last part of the Book of Wisdom, chapters 11 to 19, is a series of, as I say, diptychs. Okay, so a diptych in Flanders especially, you have lots of triptychs in churches where you have a single central panel and then two wings that close in on it. Okay, so it's in 3 parts, right? Whereas this is a diptych, so it's in 2 parts, right? It's a picture with 2 parts. And the 2 parts are all based on the 10 plagues that God sent against the Egyptians. Okay, but as I was saying earlier, the words Israel and Egypt are never mentioned. Okay, it's always the just and the godless, or your people. Sometimes it's said, speaking to God, and the godless. Right, so the first diptych is this, that God, in the first plague, turned the water of the Nile to blood. This is in chapter 11, verse 6. Right, I'm not going to go through all of these. I just want to pick out 2 of them eventually. The first diptych is that God turned the water of the Nile to blood, but for the just, for his people, he pulled water from the rock. Okay, so and not only did he turn the water of the Nile to blood, but it also mentions that this was a punishment for the fact that they had taken the boys, the Israelite boys, and thrown them into the Nile. Okay, according to Pharaoh's command in chapter 2 of the book of Exodus. Right, you with me in that? So in other words, what you have here is a crime, punishment, and a reflecting blessing upon the just. Okay, and each one reflects itself. Okay, so in other words, with God there is perfect justice in that sense. That the crime is killing the boys in the Nile, the punishment, the Nile is turned to blood, and the blessing that as the water was turned to blood, so water is brought out of the rock for the people of Israel. The second diptych then is actually quite far down, and it is in chapter 16.
How come it takes so long on that one diptych?
It doesn't. There's 2 digressions about which I have no notes for you tonight, from chapter 11:15 to 12:27, which is a first digression, and a second digression, 13 to 15. You can look at it in a few minutes if you're interested. All right. But second diptych is the plague of frogs. God sends a plague of frogs on Egypt. But for the people of Israel in the desert, he sends a flock of quails. Okay. The third one is that he sends flies and grasshoppers against Egypt, but he gives to Israel a bronze serpent. That's in chapter 16 again. The fourth diptych, which we will stop on, is that he sends rain and hail from heaven. Right? But for the people of Israel, he sends manna from heaven. Okay, so I just want to take a look at that. That's in chapter 16, beginning in verse 15. So you know the story in this case anyway. One of the plagues was that hailstones came down and they destroyed the land, all the crops in the land of Egypt. And the book of Exodus actually says this, which is a very strange thing. And the Lord rained hail upon the land of Egypt. There was hail and fire flashing continually in the midst of the hail, very heavy hail, such as had never been in all the land of Egypt since it became a nation. The hail struck down everything that was in the field throughout all the land of Egypt, both man and beast. Okay, so not only is there hail, but there's also lightning, okay, which the book of Exodus describes as fire. Right? So now, fire would usually, hail is ice, and fire is fire. Okay, so in that sense, they're opposite elements to each other. One is extreme cold, the other is heat. And the Book of Wisdom picks up on this. And it says, for most, this is 16:17, for far most incredible of all, in the water which quenches all things, the fire had still greater effect, for the universe defends the righteous. Okay, in other words, it's saying that the water of the hail should have quenched the fire, but in fact the fire was still more effective in causing destruction. And why does it say that? Because creation itself helps God to fulfill his will. Okay, so creation is God's friend in that sense. At one time the flame was restrained so that it might not consume the creatures sent against the ungodly, but that seeing this they might know that they were being pursued by the judgment of God. At another time, even in the midst of water, it burned more intensely than fire to destroy the crops of the unrighteous land. Okay, so that's the punishment that is given, is both fire and hail miraculously working together, fire and water working together, together with the creatures, the frogs and so on and so forth, all to punish the unrighteous. But instead of these things, 16:20, you gave your people food of angels. Okay, so for the people of Israel, what came down from heaven was not fire and hail, but the food of angels. And without their toil, you supply them from heaven with bread ready to eat, providing every pleasure and suited to every taste. And then it goes on in the RSV, for thy sustenance manifesteth thy sweetness toward thy children, and the bread ministering to the desire of the one who took it was changed to suit everyone's liking. Okay, so there twice it said there that the manna from heaven was according to everybody's taste. So if you wanted your manna from heaven to taste like a steak, it tasted like a steak. Okay, if you wanted it to taste like a pizza, it tasted like a pizza. Right?
Sound like you have with something from Willy Wonka's.
It does. Okay, so we have that in benediction as well. You know the phrase, the versicle there. Panem de celis prestatisti eis. Right, he gave them bread from heaven. In omnem delectaventem and se habentem. Okay, having every delight in itself. Okay, but what the Book of Wisdom says is that it changes according to the person who, according to the wishes and the desires of the person who receives it. Okay, the bread from heaven. Now, to take a closer look at what that is saying, it's good for us to see, I love saying this, the RSV, even though it's the best of English translations, the most accurate of English translations, translates this wrongly. Okay? Because it takes the word hypostasis, okay, which for us means substance, okay, and it translates it as sustenance. That's in 16:21. It says, for thy sustenance manifested thy sweetness towards thy children. And then it says, and the bread. But the Greek doesn't actually say that. The Greek simply says, and it. In other words, referring to the hypostasis of God. Okay, so God's own substance is there in the bread of heaven. Right? And it, the substance of God, ministered to the desire of the one who took it, was changed to suit everyone's liking. All right, so there you go. Two little points there.
Is that connected to the idea of transubstantiation?
It must be.
Okay.
Okay, so hypostasis has an unclear meaning for centuries after this. Okay, so even in the Council of Nicaea, when they're speaking about consubstantial, there's still debate over what exactly it means. Okay, but by and large, it would mean either the thing itself, okay, or in a biblical sense, which is what it has come to mean, settled in, I think. I bow here to the philosophers who can speak about this later on, right? But the thing in itself, the substantia, or it could mean simply the life. But even that is to say that God's life, even if it simply meant life or length of life, for thy life manifested thy sweetness towards thy children, and ministering to the desire of the one who took it, it was changed to suit everyone's liking. Okay? Or the concrete concrete realization. In the letter to the Hebrews speaks of faith as the substance of things hoped for. Okay, the hypostasis. One way or the other, it's an extremely New Testament phrase, right here in the Old Testament, right? That the hypostasis of God was present in the bread from heaven. Okay, there's a Eucharistic theology there, decades before the Last Supper, if you like. Right? And as well as that, it's really time that I finished up. Just even from a spiritual point of view, what does the bread of heaven taste like? Well, it tastes like what you want it to taste like. Okay, so in that sense, when you go to Mass, when you receive the Eucharist, what are you expecting? Are you expecting simply a ritual, which is part of your duty or something like this? Or have you really expected to be fed by the very substance of God himself? And so in that sense, the Book of Wisdom is teaching us something very important about our own participation in the Eucharist and our own belief in the Eucharist. That what are we looking for and what are we hoping for when we go to Mass? Right. So as a priest, I need to say Mass every day, right? But the Desert Fathers only said Mass twice a week, way back, and they were a lot holier than I am. And it's good for us to think that if one person received the Eucharist with perfect faith, with perfect reception towards God, then they could live the rest of their lives on that grace. It must be. Right? So I go to Mass every day because I receive the Eucharist so badly. Right? Whereas the Book of Wisdom teaches me that the more I am receptive to it in terms of its reality, if I desire it to be that great saving bread, then it will be that for me. Now, I just want to take your patience for about 2 minutes, if that's all right. The fifth diptych is a particularly interesting one, if I might say. It begins at chapter 17. It runs for the whole of chapter 17. And the punishment of the Egyptians in this time was darkness. But for the children of Israel, there was light. And what's interesting in this is that the Egyptians thought that they could punish the Israelites without any recourse to justice. That they thought that nobody was watching, nobody could see them. They were the great nation, so they could do what they wanted. So they thought that they were punishing the Israelites with nobody to see them. Right? God punished them with darkness, where nobody could see them. And they couldn't even see themselves. But it goes on to say that for thinking that in their secret sins they were unobserved behind a dark curtain of forgetfulness, they were scattered, terribly alarmed and appalled by spectres. For not even the inner chamber that held them protected them from fear, but terrifying sounds rang out about them, and dismal phantoms with gloomy faces appeared. Okay, now this is all Greek mythology coming to the fore here, right, about descent into Hades and the journeys through Hades and so on and so forth. And no power of fire was able to give them light, nor did the brilliant flames of the stars avail to illumine that hateful night. Nothing was shining true to them except a dreadful, self-kindled fire, and in terror they deemed the things which they saw to be worse than that unseen appearance. Just take a look at that last line there, 17:6. Nothing was shining through them except a dreadful, self-kindled fire. Okay? In other words, the fear that they had of the darkness was self-imposed. Right? And it goes on to say, and in terror they deemed the things which they saw to be worse than that unseen appearance. Right? In other words, one of the things that is happening to them is that they are consumed by fear, and a fear that is greater than the darkness would really allow for. Okay? Now, the secret sins, okay, which our author refers to the Egyptians and their oppression of the Israelites, also very probably refers to the mystery cults of the Egyptians, okay, which were extremely popular in the Roman Empire at this time. And these are the secret sins. So back in chapter 14, it said this: "For whether they kill children in their initiations or celebrate secret mysteries or hold frenzied revels with strange customs, for the worship of idols not to be named is the beginning and cause and end of every evil. For their worshippers either rave in exaltation or prophesy lies or live unrighteously or readily commit perjury. For because they trust in lifeless idols, they swear wicked oaths and expect to suffer no harm." Okay, so these are the secret mystery cults that would take place at night. Okay, they were so beloved in the Roman Empire. And Philo as well writes against these things. And in the special laws, Philo attacks the mystery cults in a passage which closely recalls our passage. "What is not shameful," says Philo, "does not hide itself under the shadow of the night." All right, so you see a sort of a triple reference there. You see the basic idea of the diptych of the Egyptians secretly punishing or secretly oppressing the Israelites, or at least keeping it from the other nations around about, and God then covers them in darkness. Right? But the darkness is accompanied by a fear which is self-imposed. And all of this darkness is a reflection also of the mystery cults that, of course, our young Jews in Alexandria would, some of them would be tempted to move into as well, partake in these mystery cults. All right. So, in that sense, the Book of Wisdom is, for its time, perfectly modern, that it's a response to the temptations that are coming up against the people of the time. So I'm going to leave it at that. And I think those are the main points I'd just like to say. Thank you for your patience and for your participation. Great. Staying awake most of the time.